I wore the uniform for 60 years, not for honor, for confession, because there was a secret hidden in every button, in every seam, a secret that could save me or condemn me. In 1947, I returned to a church where I had been baptized. When I entered, still in that faded uniform, the priest stopped everything. The silence was deafening. The people moved away as if I carried the plague. They were right. I was. I carried the memory of an 8-year-old girl. I carried the memory of a night when I chose disobedience. I carried the impossible hope that, in the midst of a system that demanded absolute conformity, I had been human enough. And for decades I asked myself, one life saved amid millions lost, does that mean anything? Or is it just a luxury of conscience I didn't ask permission to have? Watch until the end. Then tell me, what would you have done in my place? 2 years. It had been 2 years since I last set foot on a street that recognized me. 2 years of fleeing from corners, from faces, from any place where someone might say my name out loud. But on that July morning in 1947, I woke up knowing I couldn't wait any longer. Guilt had weight. And weight, as I learned in the war, has to be set down somewhere, or it drowns us. The uniform was still in the closet. I had kept it, as if it were a venomous animal, something that needed a cage. I took it out slowly. The fabric was faded. The torn-off insignias left small holes in the weave, like wounds that never fully heal. I put it on anyway. If I was going to confront God, I was going to do it whole. Not as the man I had pretended to be for these 2 years. As the soldier I had been. Munich still smelled of ash. Not the ash of fires, that had disappeared months ago with the hasty reconstruction, but the ash that settles in the soul of a defeated city. The streets recognized my step. Every stone knew who I was, and every stone condemned me silently. St. Michael's Church was exactly as I remembered. The oak of the door, dark and heavy. The bell that rang for Sunday Mass. I remembered the day I was baptized there. My first communion. The day my mother prayed for me to return safely. Well, I returned. But not with the safety she had prayed for. I returned broken. I pushed the door open. Father Johannes Müller's sermon echoed through the nave. Something about redemption. About forgiveness. Words I knew all too well and no longer understood. There were about 200 people. All of them turned when my footsteps, heavy, military, unmistakable, echoed on the stone floor. The silence fell like a blade. The priest stopped his sentence midway. His eyes met mine. I saw recognition, and something else, fear, anger, cross his face. He was a few years older than me. He had gray hair now. But there was something in the way he looked at me that said, "You should not be here." Slowly, so slowly that every second was torture, he raised his hand. He made the sign of the cross. It wasn't a blessing. I knew the difference. A blessing is a movement that embraces, that includes. That was protection. It was defense. It was the sign of a man telling his flock, "This one is dangerous. This one carries a shadow. This one cannot touch you." I felt the weight of 200 gazes turning away from me. I stood there for a few seconds, seconds that felt like hours. Every breath echoed in my own throat. I wanted to say something. I wanted to explain that it wasn't the uniform that made a soldier of the devil. It was the silence. It was the obedience, when the right thing would have been rebellion. It was the refusal to say no. But I said nothing. I turned and left. The air outside the church was easier to breathe. Or maybe I was just used to the suffocation. I walked through the square, still wearing that uniform that no longer belonged to me. I wanted to take it off. I wanted to burn it. But I knew I still needed it, as evidence, as a confession. That afternoon, as the sun traced its arc over the ruins of Munich, I learned something no one had taught me in the war. Forgiveness doesn't come from others. It comes from the willingness to confront yourself alone, even when no one wants you there. I left the church expecting never to return. But when I reached the square, the priest was already waiting for me. He had left through a side door, the one priests use when they need to disappear. Now, he stood there, in his cassock, his face tense with something between anger and something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe. Or recognition. Wilhelm. My name. He pronounced it as if it were a complete sentence. I didn't answer. What was there to say? That I was sorry? That I had no right to feel anything? I just stood there, still in that faded uniform, while the priest walked toward me with careful steps. The steps of a man who knows how to approach something wounded. Why did you come back wearing this? He pointed to my chest, to the Wehrmacht, to everything I had been. The question wasn't what I expected. There was no accusation. There was curiosity, an investigation, as if the priest were trying to understand something he couldn't quite grasp. Because, I answered, and my voice came out hoarse. If I'm going to confront God, I'm going to do it wearing the truth. I'm not going to pretend to be someone else. The priest took a deep breath. His shoulders fell. And then he did something I didn't expect. He sat down on the church step, as if this conversation had tired him from the start. He looked up at me, still standing. Sit down, Wilhelm. I sat. Do you know how long it takes to recognize someone? The priest was looking at the square, at the streets of Munich being laboriously rebuilt. 2 years. 2 years seeing you around the city, seeing people's eyes turn away when you pass, watching you carry that thing like it was a tombstone. I stayed silent. I knew you weren't a typical war criminal, he continued. The criminals don't come back. They don't confront their demons in public. They don't wear the uniform as a confession. How do you know? I began, but he held up a hand. Because I do the same thing, Wilhelm. Every day. I turned to look at him, and I saw for the first time, really saw, what was beneath that cassock. A man carrying his own weight. In 1943, the priest said, I was in a village near Warsaw, as a chaplain, as a man of God. He paused. I received an order to confess prisoners before their execution, to give last rites, to make God an accomplice of the machine. He breathed. I refused once, a single time. I disobeyed. And they removed me from that place, sent me to Munich. I understood. One saved lives by refusing, said the priest. How many we'll never know, nor how many one condemned by not refusing sooner. Because yes, Wilhelm, I refused only once, and during all the other days, his voice broke. During all the other days, I obeyed. The silence that followed was heavy with confession, his and mine, intertwined. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you are carrying a secret, the priest answered. It wasn't a question, it was a certainty. Something you did during the war, something that keeps you awake, something that brought you back to that door. He turned to me. And because you're not the only one who bears a heavy cross in this city, Wilhelm, we both know that redemption doesn't come from silence. It comes from the willingness to carry the truth, even when it weighs more than any stone. That afternoon, sitting step to step with a priest who had disobeyed once and carried that one time as an infinite weight, I understood that loneliness isn't being alone. Loneliness is being surrounded by people who don't understand the weight you carry. And company, true company, was finding someone who recognized that weight, because they carried it too. The night after that meeting with the priest, the memories came like snow, silent, relentless, covering everything. I closed my eyes and I was back. December 1943, Volnovaka. The kind of cold that freezes not just the skin, but the ability to think about anything other than survival. I remember the arrival as if it were yesterday. The military truck coming down the dirt road that was no longer dirt. It was disguised ice. My platoon beside me, men I had known for 2 years, men whose names I purposefully forgot after the war. It was easier that way. Cleaner. The village was small, maybe 50 houses. Smoke rose from the chimneys like prayers no one would answer. Wilhelm Hartmann, 42 years old, Wehrmacht officer, observing that place as if it were just a designation on the map. Secure the region, the orders said. 3 words that covered everything and nothing. Maria and Dmitri received me at the house where I was lodged. She had white hair. He walked slowly, as if the cold had gotten into his bones and couldn't get out. They offered me tea, bread. The kindness of people who know that hospitality toward the enemy is the only currency they possess. "How long will I be here?" I asked. "As long as the Führer needs," Dmitri answered, and I saw something in his eyes I didn't want to recognize. Resignation. He already knew. He had seen this before. The routine was established quickly. Morning patrols in the snow, checking documents in the streets. Reports I sent to command in a coded language we all pretended not to understand. Suspicious elements cited. Unusual activity documented. Euphemisms. Always euphemisms. As if the choice of words could wash one's hands. I still believed back then that it was possible to serve without becoming the service itself. That there was a distance between the uniform and the skin. That orders were just orders and disobedience was unthinkable. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed in the structure, in the hierarchy, in the system that said, "You follow, and it will all make sense later." What innocence. 2 weeks after my arrival, the whispers began. They weren't rumors. They were whispered facts. A hidden Jewish family, false documents, a child seen in a window. The information arrived through channels that pretended not to exist. Conversations between soldiers, reports from local informants, orders that came from command in language so oblique it was impossible not to understand it. "You know what to look for," said Lieutenant Bachmann, my subordinate, in a tone that wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, and I knew. Of course I knew. But in that first week, that first blessed week before everything fell apart, I could still pretend that I didn't completely know. That there was room not to see, to not act, to maintain a moral distance from the machine I served. Maria, the old woman, noticed my conflict. At our silent dinners, her eyes would meet mine with a compassion I didn't deserve. Because she knew that I knew. And she also knew that to know is to participate. "Officer," she said one night, as she served me soup, "there is always a choice, even when it seems there isn't." I didn't answer, because to answer would have been to admit there were alternatives, and to admit alternatives meant admitting guilt. In that first week in Volnovakha, I could still sleep. I could still pray. I could still see myself as a man of honor carrying out his duty. But honor is a word that loses its meaning when you know what comes next. The morning arrived with a cold that cut the answer short. January 1944. I had slept 3 hours, never more, when Lieutenant Bachmann knocked on the door with an urgency I already knew well. The urgency of orders that cannot be disobeyed. "Movement in the barn on the Kowalski property," he said, his breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. Sentries saw it. Could be a suspicious element. Suspicious element. That phrase. It meant everything and nothing at the same time. I grabbed my coat, my weapon, the automatic gestures of a soldier who doesn't question. And as I went down the stairs of Maria and Dmitri's house, I felt their eyes on my back. They said nothing, but their silence was a confession. They knew. They knew exactly what I was going to find. They knew exactly what I was ordered to do. The barn was 300 meters away. The snow was deep. My steps left tracks that looked like an accusation. The whole world was white, the whole world silent, as if nature itself had refused to bear witness. I opened the door slowly. In the dark, there was only straw and trembling. It took me a few seconds to see her. A girl, about 8 years old, crouched between bales wearing a dress that had once been white and was now gray with cold and fear. Her eyes met mine, and in that meeting, in that single, irrevocable second, I felt everything collapse. "Don't kill me," she said in Yiddish. I understood. Not because I spoke Yiddish, but because those words don't need a language. They are universal. They are the sound of pure desperation. Rivka. I learned later her name was Rivka, but in that moment, she was just a child. Just hunger, just cold, just survival in human form. My hand was on my weapon, I should, carry out the orders. It would be quick, clean. No one would know, no one would question. A soldier doing his duty, a man following the hierarchy. But then she shivered. And in that shiver, I saw my daughter. I saw Maria. I saw all the women I had known and loved and let die through indifference. Be quiet, I whispered. Not to threaten, to protect. Rivka lowered her head, as if she understood, as if she had learned in her brief life that silence is the only currency we have when the world is screaming death. I searched the property. I found a crumpled paper in her pocket, a note in Hebrew, a name, an address in Warsaw. A mother who had left her daughter in the only place she believed to be safe, because the danger I represented was less than the danger that accompanied her. In that moment, something in me broke and reformed differently. I went back to the command. My report was clean, precise. Investigation of the barn complete. No suspicious elements found. Area declared secure. Lieutenant Bachmann read my report and saw the truth. Because men who lie for the same reason recognize each other. But he said nothing. He just nodded. Maybe because he was too tired. Maybe because somewhere deep down, there was a man in Bachmann who was still breathing. Rivka stayed in the barn. I brought food, water, a blanket. Maria and Dmitri knew, of course. Their eyes told me they understood, that I had crossed a line there was no coming back from. That night, I lay in bed and couldn't sleep, because I had made my first real choice. Not a choice between obeying and disobeying, a choice between the uniform and my conscience, between the machine and the man. And when I closed the barn door behind me for the first time, I felt I had just destroyed my own soul, or perhaps I had saved it. 3 weeks. Rivka stayed in the barn for 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. Every day was a theft. Every meal I brought was a crime. Every breath she took was evidence. Maria would leave food in the kitchen, by mistake. Dmitri would turn his eyes away when I passed with bread hidden under my coat. They said nothing. Maybe because speaking would make it real. Maybe because silent complicity is the only form of compassion left when the whole world has become a tribunal. But Lieutenant Bachmann knew. He had no proof, but he knew. I saw it in his eyes. That mixture of knowledge and reticence that marks men who have already decided which side of hell to be on. It started with small questions. Hartman, any more movement in the barn? Do you personally check that sector regularly? Questions that seemed procedural. Questions that were, in fact, tests. Of course, Lieutenant, I would reply. And I would lie. Lie after lie. Layers and layers of falsehood building an edifice I knew would collapse. I falsified documents. I manipulated patrol logs. I invented sightings in other sectors to direct attention away from the barn. Every lie was a thread I pulled from the rope holding everything together. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that when that rope broke, there would be no turning back. The paranoia was constant. Every night, I woke up imagining that Bachmann had contacted command, that orders were on their way, that the SS would come, that everything would collapse and Rivka would be discovered. And I wouldn't know if she'd have time to run, if the peasants could save her, if that piece of paper with the address in Warsaw would be enough. Then the transfer order arrived. 48 hours. I had 48 hours to get out of Volnovaca. 48 hours before another officer arrived and discovered there was a child missing from the records. 48 hours before the system adjusted itself and found what I had hidden. That last night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I planned. A map I got from a local peasant, routes through the mountains, paths that avoided checkpoints. A name, Kaspar, a man who had lost his daughter and who had whispered to Maria that he would help any child he could. A backpack, food, that crumpled paper with the address in Warsaw. I took Rivka from the barn in the last hour before dawn. She was so light. An 8-year-old child weighs almost nothing when you carry her, as if she were salvation, as if she were damnation. Her small arms clung to my neck, and I felt, for the first time in months, the full weight of what I had done. Not just saving her, but tying her to me, making her dependent on a Wehrmacht soldier, on a man who could be discovered at any moment. "You're going to be okay," I whispered. But it was a lie, the cruelest of all the lies I had told. Caspar was waiting at the edge of the forest. His face was a mountain, hard, expressionless, impenetrable. He looked at Rivka, and then at me, and in that gaze there was judgment and compassion in equal parts. "Warsaw?" he asked. "Warsaw," I confirmed. The address on the note, her mother. Caspar took the paper as if it were a historical document, as if he understood that this small piece of paper was all that was left of an entire world. Rivka didn't cry when I handed her over. She just looked at me with eyes that shouldn't have held that much wisdom, eyes that had seen too much, lived too much. "Thank you, sir," she said in Yiddish. Those words, the child thanking the soldier who was saving her, the child, polite even in death. I watched as Caspar took her and disappeared into the forest. And in that moment, that exact moment when the darkness swallowed her, I understood that hope and loss are the same thing. That saving someone means never knowing if they were actually saved. That the price of humanity is to live forever with the doubt that it was enough. When I left Volnovakha, there was still hope. When I arrived in Munich in May 1945, hope had died somewhere between Ukraine and Germany. What was left was just a shell. The city was devastated. British and American bombings had left scars that would never completely heal. Buildings with only one wall standing, like men who had lost half of themselves. The streets I had known since I was a boy were now the landscape of another planet. And the people, God. The people walked like ghosts, searching for their own graves. I exchanged the uniform for civilian clothes, but I couldn't exchange what was under the skin. I found my sister Greta in a refugee shelter. She had survived the bombings because she was in a bunker when the bomb hit our house. Our mother was not. My older sister was not. The neighbors were not. Greta just sat down when she saw me and took a deep breath, not of relief, but of added burden, as if my return meant one more person to worry about. "Wilhelm," she said, "just my name, no emotion, no hug." "Greta." She turned away. "I heard stories about you, that you were on the Eastern Front." "Yes." "What did you do there?" The question was simple, but it contained everything. It contained accusation, curiosity, judgment, everything all of Germany was doing in those days. Looking at the soldiers who returned and silently asking, "Did you know? Did you participate? Were you a man, or were you a machine?" "I carried out orders," I replied. And it was true. It was also a lie. She didn't answer. She just carried on. And that silence was worse than any accusation. I tried to find work, anything. But my military history preceded me. No one wanted to employ a Wehrmacht soldier. No one wanted to be contaminated by the association. The entire city was in the process of cleansing its conscience, everyone declaring that they had always known, that they had always resisted internally, that they never really believed, as if the collective guilt could be divided equally and distributed until it disappeared. The nights were worse. I would lie down on a borrowed mattress and close my eyes, but I didn't sleep, because sleeping meant dreaming, and dreaming meant boots in the snow, the sound of them marking a rhythm on the ice, the breathing of men in a line, the lieutenant's voice giving orders I can't quite hear, but whose meaning is absolute. And then, always then, the cry of a child. Rivka's cry, not of fear, of cold, the sound of someone whose small body was surrendering to the winter. I would wake up sweating. I would wake up with my hands shaking. No one in Munich wanted to hear about it. They wanted confessions from explicit criminals, from the SS, from ideologues. They didn't want to hear about ordinary soldiers, about men who obeyed and who in a single moment disobeyed. Because admitting that such men existed meant admitting there was a choice. And admitting choice meant admitting personal guilt. 2 years. 2 years carrying that piece of paper in my pocket. The address in Warsaw, Rivka's mother's note. That proof of my humanity. I could have revealed it. I could have said, I saved a Jewish child. I disobeyed. I am good. But revealing it would mean exposure. It would mean investigation. It would perhaps mean justice, because even saving one child doesn't erase the others I didn't save, the millions I didn't save. And no court would be interested in nuances, in gray men, in partial compassion. So I carried the paper, and I carried the silence. Night after night, I woke up with boots in the snow, with a child's cry, with my mother's voice, my dear mother who had died in the bombings, screaming my name in a language that wasn't language. It was just the sound of pure desperation. For 2 years, I carried the proof of my humanity in my pocket, and it was never enough to save me. Then, in the summer of 1947, I did something I had sworn I would never do. I went back to St. Michael's Church in search of redemption. This time, not during the sermon. This time, during the afternoon confession, when only old women pray for the dead. I entered through the side door. My heart was pounding like a trapped animal. The confession booth was dark. It always was. But on that day, the darkness felt different. Not like an absence of light, but like the presence of a secret. As if the booth itself knew I was coming to dig everything up. I knelt. Father, I have a secret, I began. And then, for the first time in 3 years, I spoke aloud. The village, the girl, her name, her face, the barn, the paper with the address, the mother who had left her behind, the hope that the peasants could get her to Warsaw, the falsified report, the lies piled on lies. Lieutenant Bachmann, who knew and pretended not to, Maria and Dmitri with their silent eyes. Everything, absolutely everything. When I finished, I was shaking. The silence in the booth was absolute. So absolute I could hear my own breathing, and his, just breathing. No condemnation, no performative absolution. Just 2 men breathing in the dark. Her name was Rivka, the priest finally asked. Yes. And you don't know if she made it to Warsaw? No, I never knew. Another silence. Longer. And then, in a way I didn't expect, I heard Father Müller's voice break, almost whispering, I have a secret too, Wilhelm. My whole body tensed. In 1943, I was a chaplain in a camp near Warsaw. My job was to give last rites, a final blessing. A pause. One night, I received an order to confess prisoners before their liquidation. Women, children, people whose only crime was to exist. He took a deep breath. I refused once, a single time. I said I couldn't, that it was against the faith, that God would not sanction it. My body thawed slightly. And you? I was removed, sent to Munich, saved, so to speak. A pause. But Wilhelm, on all the other days I obeyed. On all the days before and after, I put on the cassock and did what they asked. And do you know how many times I refused again? Silence from me, because I knew the answer. None, the priest continued. Not one other time. A single refusal, and then conformity. And that is what I carry. That is what I pray about every night. Not for that one time I said no, but for all the times I said yes. I had never thought of it that way. That redemption, if such a thing exists, doesn't come from one great act of courage. It comes from that small act, that little no you whisper against the machine. And that guilt, true guilt, comes not from that no, but from all the other yeses that came before and after. Forgiveness, the priest said, and his voice was different now, not of a judge, but of a companion. Doesn't come from being righteous. It comes from admitting that you tried, that even if you failed 1,000 times, there was that one moment when you chose humanity. There was that child. There was that whispered no. But it wasn't enough, I said. One child amid millions. No, the priest agreed. It will never be enough. Because evil is like the ocean, Wilhelm. You can save one life, and the ocean remains. But that life is everything to that person. To Rivka, you were the entire universe. And then the priest did something that would change everything. Wilhelm, I need you to do something, not as redemption, as a testament. What? Find her. Look for that address in Warsaw. Find out if she made it. Not to save yourself, to bear witness. Because if she made it, if that child is alive somewhere, then your choice mattered. And that matters. In that dark booth, two men broken by the war discovered that forgiveness doesn't come from the weight being lifted. It comes from the burden being shared. It comes from someone saying, I carry this too. I made choices too. And you are not alone. That night, when I left the church, I removed the uniform for the first time in 2 years. But this time it wasn't abandonment. It was preparation. The first letter I wrote was to the International Red Cross. My hands were shaking as I typed, not from cold, but from fear. Fear of hope. Fear that an answer would mean discovering Rivka was dead. Fear that no answer would mean she never really existed. That she was just a memory of a man broken by war. I sent the letter. Weeks. Nothing. I wrote to Jewish refugee agencies, to orphanages in Poland, to communities rebuilding after the horror. With every letter I pressed on the typewriter, I felt I was committing a crime. A German man looking for a Jewish child. As if I had the right. As if I had any right to redemption. The replies when they came were negative. No record. No match. Impossible to verify. Every no was like that icy morning in the barn repeating itself infinitely. The indefensible void. The certainty that I had done everything wrong, saved her the wrong way, left her the wrong way, hoped the wrong way. I met other men, veterans like me. Some were looking for children they had left in occupied cities. Others were looking for entire families who had disappeared. We were all specters. We all carried papers, addresses, names, fragments of lives we might never have really lived. One man, Hans his name was, had been looking for his daughter for 5 years. Did you find her? I asked. He just shook his head. And after a moment, I stopped hoping to find her. Now I just hope she was loved. That someone held her the way I would have held her. That broke me. Because Hans had reached the point I was still trying to avoid. The point where redemption stops being about you and becomes only about the child. Just the hope that she lived with kindness. Then one day, it wasn't a special day, it was just a day. A woman came into the cafe where I worked cleaning tables. Small, elderly, eyes that had seen too much. Are you Wilhelm? She asked. Yes. My name is Rachel Kowalski. I know you're priest. My body froze. He said you were looking for a girl, a child named Rivka. I couldn't breathe. There's a cafe a few blocks from here, Rachel continued. I have a small cafe. My husband died in the war, your war. But we have a past we share, you know. She sat down. A few days ago, I had a woman visit. She came to talk about the Holocaust, about stories of salvation. And she mentioned she knew a peasant, a man named Kaspar, who helped children flee Volnovaka. My heart pounded. Kaspar mentioned a girl, Rivka. Said he took her to Warsaw in 1944. Said she was taken in by a refugee organization. Rachel took a deep breath. The woman who heard the story. She works in an orphanage in Warsaw now. And she thinks she might know who Rivka is. I thought I was going to faint. But she wants to meet you first. She wants to know your story. Not the story of a German soldier, but the story of Wilhelm, of the man who didn't pull the trigger. I wrote the letter that night. Not to agencies, to Rivka herself, or to whoever she was now. I told her everything. The barn, the cold, the paper with the address, the peasants, the impossible hope I had carried for 3 years. A week later, I received a reply. We found someone, but you need to come. You need to come to Warsaw. You need to be here. That night, I removed the uniform, that uniform I had kept for 4 years, and packed it in a suitcase. Not to burn it, to take it as evidence, as a confession, as a testament. The journey to Warsaw would be the longest of my life, not because of the distance, but because of the weight of everything I would be carrying back. The train to Warsaw took 2 days. 2 days in which I couldn't think about anything but what would happen when I arrived. 2 days carrying that uniform in my suitcase as if it were a confession that had to be delivered in person. When I got off at the station, my hands were shaking. The orphanage was a gray building, rebuilt among ruins. There were still bullet scars on the walls. There was still a phantom smoke in the air, the memory of fire, even if the fire had been out for years. A woman named Esther greeted me. Her eyes were ancient. Her eyes had seen what no one should have to see. "She is ready to meet you," Esther said. "But I have to warn you, she is not the girl you left in the barn. No one is." That made sense. Ruth was in a small courtyard, helping other children with needlework. When she looked up and saw me, something happened I wasn't prepared to feel. Recognition. Not of the face, of the soul. She was 18 years old. Rivka had been 8 when I left her. A decade of war and survival was written in every line of her body, but her eyes still had that quality I had seen that icy morning. Intelligence, resilience, a humanity that shouldn't have survived. "Wilhelm?" she asked in German. Her German was perfect. "Learned where? When?" "Yes, you are Ruth now. Rivka died in Warsaw. Ruth was born." She stood up, walked toward me. "I recognize you. Not from your face. I recognize you from the nightmares." That knocked me over. "But they aren't bad nightmares," Ruth continued. "They're nightmares where someone refuses, where someone says no, where someone saves me instead of—" Her voice broke. "Instead of doing what I expected them to do." We sat on a cracked wooden bench. The same bench where other children who also had, continued their needlework, as if the world hadn't collapsed. As if children could learn to sew while their parents were ash. "Kaspar took me," Ruth said, and her words were a confession too. "It took 3 weeks crossing mountains. I was 8 years old. I was cold. I was afraid. But he spoke of a soldier who had said no, a soldier who had chosen disobedience, and that gave me the strength to walk." "Your mother?" I asked. "She arrived in Warsaw 5 months later. She was thin. She was broken. But she was alive. We were reunited in an orphanage. We were happy. Not completely happy. No one could be back then. But we were alive together." A pause. "My father was not so lucky. Treblinka. I found out later." I began to cry. Not in a controlled way. In the way broken men cry, with my whole body convulsing. Ruth placed her hand on my shoulder. Her hand. The girl I had saved. The woman who had learned that compassion is possible even after everything humanity had done. "You were a soldier who refused to obey," she said. "That is redemption enough." Those words, those simple words shattered everything I had carried for 4 years. They didn't destroy the guilt. The guilt remains. But they transformed the guilt into something different, into a testament, into a memory, into an obligation not of salvation, but of remembrance. We spent that afternoon talking. Ruth told me about Warsaw, about how she had learned to live with the emptiness, about how she had helped other children in the orphanage, about how she had decided to live, not as a victory over evil, but as a daily response to evil, as a daily refusal to let death have the last word. And when it was time to leave, Ruth hugged me. That hug, the hug of a girl who had grown up in a barn, who had survived occupied Warsaw, who had learned that the world contains horror. That hug was everything I didn't deserve to receive and everything I needed to understand that life goes on. When Ruth hugged me that afternoon in Warsaw, I felt that the girl in the barn finally had her ending. But my story was still unfinished. 57 years. That's how long it took for me to understand that redemption isn't a destination. It's a daily practice. I returned to Munich different, or maybe not different, just more true. I removed the uniform from the suitcase and hung it on a rack, not as a relic, as a testament. Because in that uniform was everything I had been. The blind obedience, the hesitation, the choice, the guilt, the attempt to be human in a system that forbade humanity. I started working at St. Michael's Church. Father Müller asked me to be the treasurer, to manage funds for rescue organizations, for refugee communities, for Holocaust memorial centers. Simple work that only required me to move money from one place to another. But I knew that every coin was a memory. It was a testament. It was a refusal to forget. Then people started to come, first historians, then young people, then people who had simply heard about a soldier who had saved a child and wanted to know if it was true, if it was possible. If in the midst of the horror, there really was a choice. At first I didn't want to tell it. The story was private. It was my guilt, my redemption, if redemption even exists for a man like me. But Ruth, my Ruth, she insisted. One day when she came to visit me from Warsaw, she sat me down in front of a tape recorder and said, "You need to speak, not for you, for the next generations. They need to know that a choice exists, even when it seems like it doesn't." So I spoke. I told everything: the village, the girl, the barn, the falsified report, Maria and Dmitri, Kaspar, the night I let her go, the 4 years of not knowing if she had survived, the search, the reunion. Historians documented it. Young people listened. Some cried. Others questioned. Why only one child? Why not more? And in those questions, I saw the truth I had carried for decades. One life spared doesn't erase millions lost. One right choice doesn't redeem 1,000 wrong ones. But I also saw another truth. Bearing witness matters. Because when a young person stands up after hearing my story and says, "I would never accept that," I would say no. In that moment, something changes. In that moment, the choice stops being just mine. It becomes a historical possibility. It becomes a seed that is planted. At 57, I understood that I would never be completely redeemed. Complete redemption is a lie we tell ourselves. But I also understood that saying no, even in a whisper, even alone, even if it costs you everything, is a revolutionary act. It is refusal. It is humanity in the form of silent disobedience. I kept working. I kept telling the story. I kept living with the cross, but no longer as a weight that drowned me, as a responsibility, as a memory. Ruth grew old alongside me. She became a teacher. She taught about the Holocaust. And in every class, she mentioned a German soldier who had said no, who had chosen, who had been human when it was easier for him to be a machine. When I died, and yes, this is happening now, I am telling this from a place that is not exactly here, nor completely there. Ruth was by my side. She called me my soldier who said no. And that simple title, was all I needed to understand that life isn't about absolution. It's about the attempt. It's about the small no we whisper against the collective scream of evil. The cross that Wilhelm finally carried with lightness was not the cross of God asking for redemption. It was the cross of a man who had simply tried to be human when humanity was forbidden. This is not something I read. This happened. This happened to someone I knew. And it still happens, in silence, in secret, in small refusals, in every generation that faces its own dilemma. Because the silence that follows this story, Wilhelm's silence, is the same one that continues in each of us, that of small choices that can save or condemn, each one of them a door, each one of them forever. And you, when your time comes, when the world asks you to obey, will you be the kind of person who says yes, or will you be the one who whispers no?